Thanks so much for joining here today, Dr. Tarrant.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So, for those of you who aren't familiar, Jeff Tarrant here is the founder and director of the Neuromeditation Institute in Eugene, Oregon. He's also a licensed psychologist and board certified in neurofeedback. So, he's got a long history of knowledge and research in this field, and we use neuromeditation as a technique. Mike teaches neuromeditation in our online coaching, and so I thought it would be so great to have the man himself come on and share a little bit about it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, whatever you want to talk about, I'm game.
Beautiful, beautiful. Well, maybe we can just start with some of the basics, just to get people who aren't familiar with it oriented. And so I'm curious a little bit about actually your personal story about how you first got interested in meditation, because I know, I went to a school to become a licensed counselor, and meditation wasn't really talked about, in the academy. And so I'm so curious how you first got into that.
Yeah, I mean, probably my first interest was as an undergrad student. And, I'm not even sure how I stumbled into it, but I started taking classes on philosophy and religious studies. And, prior to that, I had no background experience with really any spiritual traditions or meditation at all. It wasn't even a part of my internal landscape in the slightest bit. And, I took a class on Hinduism and then I took a class on Buddhism. And I loved it. I was like, oh my God, like this makes so much sense. Like just the philosophy and the theory resonated. And it was the first time that I found something from more of a spiritual tradition that actually made sense to me. And, but this was an academic class. There wasn't any meditation involved. It was all theory and concepts, and so of course I knew meditation was a part of all of this, and so really wanted to do it. I was like, okay, well, how do I do this? Like I'm learning about it, but this was the late '80s, early '90s in mid-Missouri.
Okay.
Good luck finding a place to learn about meditation, at that time. So I had an interest for years before I finally found a teacher. And there happened to be a Zen monk who was actually teaching at the University of Missouri. He was teaching in the English department. And so he had a small group that would meet at his house. He kind of had a little miniature Zendo built in his house. And so that was my first introduction. And so, from then on, it was just kind of a continual learning process and experimenting with different traditions and finding new teachers. Of course, they got easier and easier as time went. And, meditation started really getting more of more interest and more attention in the public sphere. So yeah, and so it's just continued since then.
Yeah, that's so fascinating, Jeff. I feel like meditation and mindfulness have become such buzzwords in psychology that a lot of people do forget that the roots are in spiritual practice. And so you really came to it through Buddhist or Hindu practices. And I want to add too, or get your thoughts on this, because we also have a lot of people who are following more Christian faiths as well coming to us. And sometimes I think there's this idea that it's only Buddhists that have meditation as a part of their spiritual practice, which I really think is actually not true at all. There's all sorts of people like John Main and other folks who find roots of meditation in Christian practice as well. But I'm just curious if you've explored other religious traditions since then and seen some of those connections.
Yeah, I mean, personally, my own spiritual path has, I've explored a lot of different things, and now I wouldn't necessarily identify myself with any particular spiritual tradition. There's a lot of aspects of a lot of different traditions that I appreciate and enjoy and incorporate into what I do. But to your point, for a while when I was teaching at the University of Missouri, so got all my degrees, was still living in the same area, started working at the university, and I was teaching mindfulness-based stress reduction. which many people will be familiar with because, again, like you pointed out, it's made such inroads, but in sort of a secular way. And that's what MBSR, mindfulness-based stress reduction, it's an 8-week structured group format to teach some of these concepts. And the reason I'm bringing it up is because we would have people sign up, and this happened every semester. They would sign up and they would come to me at the very first class and say, I'm Catholic,
Right.
and I'm worried that what we're going to be doing here is going to contradict, my beliefs and it was interesting because it was like, well, how did you sign up for this? Like what, they had these concerns, but yet they signed up.
Right.
And of course, my answer was always like, hey, if we ever say or do anything that contradicts your spiritual belief system, ignore whatever I'm saying, right? Like,
Sure.
obviously your personal spiritual beliefs should come first. But what was interesting is every semester, those same students would come up to me at the end and be like, hey, you know what? Not only did this not contradict, but it actually enhanced my own spiritual practice. And I thought that was interesting because it wasn't just Catholics. I mean, we had pick a faith. It didn't really matter.
Right.
But I thought that was really interesting and a good confirmation that these practices really, they don't have to be from a particular tradition. If you're inviting people to go inward and to connect with something bigger, whatever that is, it's going to enhance whatever your system is, whatever your belief system is. And so anyway, I really appreciated that. And I appreciate those students for taking the risk of kind of going like, I don't know what I'm getting myself into here, but okay, I'll try it,
Yeah. Yeah, that's such a beautiful story and such a testament to the idea that these are really universal concepts, that not only is it not going to contradict whatever faith tradition that you might be a part of, or if you're part of no faith tradition, but it might actually enhance your spiritual practice through some of the shifts that happen in the brain through the process. So I really am excited to get to that as well. So yeah, at this point, you actually started studying meditation from more of a neuroscientific perspective, and I'm so curious, what were some of the biggest initial things that you discovered as you got into this research that really like turned some light bulbs onto you and got you actually developing the concept of neuromeditation?
Yeah, I mean, in hindsight, of course, things look different than in the moment, but
Yes.
but when I look back, developing this process was really probably a 10-year process that I didn't know that that's what was happening
Yeah.
in the moment. But, one of the first things was, I've been in the field of neurofeedback about the same amount of time that I'd been practicing
Okay.
meditation.
Yeah.
And, for those that aren't familiar, neurofeedback basically just involves monitoring your brainwave activity and getting information about your brainwaves back to you in real time, feedback. So seeing something or hearing something that's telling you what your brainwaves are doing. And when we do that, you can learn to change your brainwave patterns. And so typically in my world, because I'm a psychologist, we would use that for mental health concerns. Can we help the brain be more flexible to, facilitate some sort of adaptation to anxiety or depression or ADHD or whatever it might be? Anyway, a lot of the origins of neurofeedback came from meditation. It got started in the 1960s, neurofeedback. And so the hippies got a hold of this technology. And, we're trying to figure out, how to use this to enhance their meditation practice. And so it was all about alpha. Increasing alpha brainwaves was the be-all, end-all. Everybody thought that was the solution to all the problems.
Interesting.
I'm exaggerating a little bit, but not much.
And for those who don't know, alpha is the calm but alert brain waves. Is that correct?
Yeah, it's kind of in the middle of the
Yeah.
frequency spectrum,
Yeah.
and a lot of this idea that meditation was alpha was created by some early research. And what they found was that, when they would measure a meditator, their alpha would increase pretty dramatically. And so that all made sense. So, of course, I was doing neurofeedback. I'm also practicing meditation. start learning about some of this early research with combining them. And I was like, oh, yeah, of course. Why, And so I started hooking myself up and doing these alpha protocols, and they didn't do anything for me. I mean, I did it. I think at one point I did maybe 50 sessions in a row, like every day.
Wow.
And it was like, I was getting nothing. And I'm like, okay, like something's wrong
No,
with
like
me.
mental
Yes.
health improvements. Is that what you're saying? Like you just weren't noticing any shift in the positive direction or any shift at
No.
all?
And not
Yeah.
even in my meditation, like
Yeah.
even that, it didn't seem to correspond to my internal state very well. And so I was like, I don't get it. Like I'm missing something. So literally I just dropped it and said, okay, I'm kind of done messing with this. And years later, when I really started reading some of the literature and some of the brain research started getting more sophisticated, came to learn that, well, alpha is really about an internal versus an external state of attention. It actually doesn't, it's really not a very good metric for are you meditating? It's a good
Mm.
metric for is your attention inside or is it outside?
Oh,
But
okay.
but you can have your attention inside and be thinking about the football game on Saturday or
Right.
whatever, right? And so it's actually not a very good metric for meditation. And so for me, when I started learning things like that and started to see that, oh, wait a minute, there's different ways to meditate and different styles of meditation affect the brain differently. And so for me, that was the big aha moment that it's like, oh, wait a minute, there's so much more. It's not just about alpha. And so it's not that I can't meditate or I can't use alpha feedback. It's that it was too simple. Our understanding, the process was oversimplified to the point that it just didn't work for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then when I started looking at it, I was like, oh my gosh, there's so much more information here, and understanding that different states of consciousness have different brainwave patterns and there's different brain regions involved. And so for me, that really opened up my world in a really significant way to start to figure out, well, what are these different states of consciousness? And, how can we help people learn to navigate this in a way that's a little bit more streamlined, right? Because I did traditional Zen training, with a Rinzai monk, like I mentioned. And, that style of training is very much like sit on your cushion and just keep sitting
Yeah.
until you figure it out.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a little bit more to it, but that's a lot of it.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, I mean, I'm a pretty stubborn person, and so I'm willing to do that for a while. But your average person isn't just going to sit for years at a time hoping they figure it out. So even though it's a very Western perspective, it's like, well, wait a minute, we can understand this, and we can understand this in a way that actually makes sense,
Yeah.
and we can explain to people, which for me anyway, then makes it much easier to learn how to do those things. So it's a long answer, but
No, that's really beautiful. It's like it's so much the idea that we can optimize this. And, I think it's also important that we recognize that a lot of these practices were developed in very different times and places than, a modern Western world. And so there are going to be psychological aspects, emotional aspects, sociocultural aspects just aren't going to translate as well or just aren't going to be more effective. And I really want to dig in a little more. You mentioned briefly, there's not just one way to meditate. And I think for some people that just there is like a, wait, what? Because, like you said, I think so many people have this idea of meditation of like, oh, you just go sit on a pillow and you sit there until something happens. And, if you have ADHD or PTSD or, all sorts of various issues, like that is just not going to work.
nope.
And so, would you share a little bit more about the different types of meditation that you were able to distinguish out?
Sure. And when we started looking at this, I was, like I said, I was kind of looking at the research literature because there's so much regarding meditation and what's going on in the brain. And, other researchers, other folks way smarter than me had already started to classify meditations based on how you're using your attention and what your intention is. And so, they came up with their own kind of research categories. And so largely what we did was kind of borrow that and try to make it a little bit more user friendly, because some of the language used in the research is not, it's research language. So it's not the easiest to translate. And so, really, we initially started off with kind of 4, we call them styles of meditation, but you could really call them styles of consciousness, or types of consciousness involved in meditation. And so, there's obvious things that people will understand right away, which is like focus, or like a concentration practice, which pretty much anybody who's ever tried to meditate, that's probably what they were doing. Focus on your breath. When your mind wanders, catch it and bring it back to your breath. It's a focus practice. You're learning to sustain attention, to hold your attention on one target, which is really hard to do. Again, anybody that's ever tried this knows that, yeah, good luck with that, right? Like that's, the mind doesn't like to just stay in one boring spot. It likes to run around and entertain itself. Yeah. So, we've got that. But then there's other ways of meditating that are more like a mindfulness practice. And, even though we use that term, we're using it in a specific way to identify a specific type of attention, which is more of an open attention. So you're still paying attention, but it's not like you're lasered in on one thing. Mm-hmm. It's more of a way to allow whatever is happening to become part of your awareness, but without attaching to any of it. So you might be aware of a body sensation, or a thought, or a feeling, or the sound of the traffic outside, or the color of the wall, whatever. You can be aware of these things, but you don't grasp onto them and turn them into a story. So that's very different than focus. And even when you just describe it, it's kind of like, oh, well, yeah, like that's totally different. Mm-hmm. And so, not surprisingly, if you're using your attention differently, the brain looks different. You're using the brain differently. And then there's practices like open heart. We call it open heart, but it's, loving kindness, compassion, gratitude, any practice where you're intentionally activating a positive feeling state. Yeah. And then usually we're doing something with that. For instance, sending it out to others, right? Like a typical loving kindness practice. And even though that requires a level of focus, you've got this added element of emotion, of a positive emotion, which is not really part of the other ones that we've described. Yeah. So again, there's a difference. There's something that's different about that. Yeah. Then we have quiet mind. Again, this is a stereotype of meditation, right? That you sit down, you sit on your pillow, like you described, and then you just empty your mind.
That's the one that I feel like the most people just assume we're talking about when we say meditation. At least in my experience, it's like, oh yeah, you're supposed to get your mind quiet. Oh, I can't do that, so I can't do meditation, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it is a thing. And, I joke sometimes, and actually I saw it in one of your guys' recent posts that you put quieter mind on there, which
that's Mike's doing. Yeah, I love that.
Yeah, which I love. And, and I say that a lot because of exactly what you're describing, that people have the idea that if they can't get their mind to be completely silent, then somehow they can't meditate. Yeah. And the reality is what we're saying is, can you get your mind to be quieter? So if it's running around, if it's cranked up at a 9, can you get it down to a 7? Mm-hmm. And then if it's at a 7, can you get it to a 6? Right? So it's about sort of learning to relax into a state where the mind isn't dominating your internal world, all that noise. And so that's its own set of practices. And then more recently, we've been more formally talking about a 5th style. We've been kind of keeping it on the down low.
Okay. I get some exclusive info here. I love it.
Yeah, you heard it here first.
Yeah.
So the 5th style that we talk about now is we call deep states. And even though this isn't covered as much in the research literature, it's an important state of consciousness that we're aware of in meditation. And it kind of gets neglected sometimes. And so this is more of it's harder to describe too, which makes it a little more challenging
Mm-hmm.
because it's kind of getting into a state where you're not focused on anything in particular, and you're also like letting the mind just kind of go. So
Okay.
it can almost feel a little bit like daydreaming,
Mm-hmm.
except that the content might be different. So maybe I should say more just like dreaming, right? Because like when you're in a dreaming state, you're not consciously directing any of it, right? Your subconscious mind is kind of running the show. Your conscious mind is out of the way. Well, we can do that in a more alert, conscious state. You don't have to be asleep. So getting into a place where you get into this very deep place where the mind is free. And so that's an interesting place. And people can have a lot of different kinds of experiences with that. But that's unique as well.
Yeah.
And so if we kind of create these categories for people, then they can start to see like, oh, I get it. Okay, I see that there's different approaches,
Mm-hmm.
different styles of consciousness that you may want to tap into. And then it's like, well, okay, well, once you've identified, well, which one are you interested in? How can we help you get there? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that was such a helpful description because I think people will already be able to hear a little bit about what they might need versus like what maybe comes more naturally to them because we're approaching all of these meditation styles with our own kind of unique brain patterns, right? And so, as you're describing those, it's like, okay, someone who is hyper focused, hyper vigilant, kind of obsessive in personality, like focus might come actually very easy to them, like a focus or concentration practice. Maybe that's not what they need to be building more. So this is where the kind of brain retraining aspect of this can really come in, because for that person, maybe more of an open state, more of a mindful state might actually benefit them more to rebalance. Where if someone's like kind of daydreamy and unfocused, then maybe what they need more is that focus or concentration style. Is that, am I getting kind of what you're going for?
Exactly.
Yeah.
You've got it exactly right. And that's actually from our approach, that's a challenging aspect for some people because basically what we're saying is the style of meditation that might be best for your specific goals and needs is likely to be the thing that's the hardest,
Yes.
which
Yeah.
actually makes a lot of sense when you think about it.
Hmm.
Because if it's easy to do, well, you don't need that. You already know how to do that. And so what we know about psychological well-being is that it's very much tied into psychological flexibility.
Mm.
So being able to shift states at will,
Mhm.
right? So when it's time to be focused, you can be focused. When it's time to relax, you can relax, or whatever it might be. But being able to do that and to move your consciousness however you desire. And so we know that that's very highly connected to just feeling, being at your best, whatever that is. And we also know that, very often if people are struggling with something like anxiety or depression or whatever, that the brain is kind of stuck.
Yeah.
So there's certain ways that it might be really good at engaging, but then there's other ways it just really doesn't have the foggiest idea. And so that's what we want to develop, right? We want to develop these other aspects. And so that's another way that this kind of system can be used is to figure out, well, what do you need, to be healthier, whatever that might look like.
Yeah.
And then again, how do we get you there?
Yeah, yeah. And I'm wondering if I can give you kind of a hypothetical, because we have a lot of people coming to our programs who have often experienced a lot of trauma. Sometimes have a PTSD diagnosis from things that have happened in their life, but also a lot of medical trauma. We work with a lot of people who have had really big health scares, maybe really bad experiences in the medical institutions, things like that. And so, um, obviously for someone with those experiences, some types of meditation are not going to be as useful or might actually be triggering, and some might be more indicated. And so I'm curious, someone coming to you like that, where would you start them out or how would you approach that?
Yeah, interestingly, usually if somebody has a pretty significant trauma history that maybe isn't fully resolved, right? Because that's important too. Like maybe they've done their therapy work and everything
Yeah.
else, and they're in a pretty good place. That may be different. But if somebody has a lot of unresolved trauma, a lot of these types of practices can be really difficult, if not actually creating more problems.
Yeah.
And the example I give frequently with this is like with mindfulness and like doing a body scan, which is a very common practice.
Yeah.
We do it all the time, but you're essentially guiding people through every part of their body and saying, okay, pay attention to your toes. Breathe in and out of your toes. Okay, great. Now move to the sole of your feet. Breathe in and out of the sole of your feet. And you're just kind of going through this and you're asking people to just be present with whatever is there and have no connection to it, right? And so for most people with a trauma history, there's going to be some significant connections for different parts of their body to whatever their trauma is, whether it was some sort of abuse or whether it was some sort of a medical trauma. And so asking people to connect with that, that may be way too much. It may be overwhelming. They may be forced to kind of go into a dissociative state so that they don't have to connect to that. And so these are things, of course, that we don't want to happen, right? And I suspect that the reason a lot of people don't stick with meditation practices is because of this kind of thing, that they start to meditate, but it's really uncomfortable, or it brings up some stuff, that was in the subconscious that they're not really at a place to deal with right now. And so very often, if somebody's really having a hard time, we'll start actually with an eyes open focus practice. And it's kind of the foundation for all of the other meditations. But one of the things that's really nice about eyes open focus is your attention is external.
Mm-hmm.
And so with somebody with a lot of trauma history, when the attention's internal, that's where it can be really, really difficult. You go inside and all of a sudden you're aware of your feelings, or you're aware of what's happening in your body that is not pleasant or is difficult. But if your attention's external, it feels safer. So having the eyes open, focusing externally can be a really useful strategy, or involving movement. So again, you stay grounded, you stay in your body, you stay connected. You're giving your mind something to do, something to pay attention to. So it's almost a little bit like a distraction, right? Like if you've got a lot of things to pay attention to, it's going to be harder for your mind to lock into whatever kind of stuff it wants to go to by default. So this is exactly the kind of thing that we try to create with this system, is like, how can we help people figure out the best starting place based on where they're at? So we talk about it as being sort of a developmental process, kind of meeting people where they are and say, okay, well, here's where you're at. So great, let's start there. And let's find a way to engage that's going to work for you. And then as you develop some skill, so being able to sustain attention for longer periods of time, well, then maybe you start to intermix it with, okay, well, let's do some eyes closed focus. So maybe a couple of minutes eyes open, a couple of minutes eyes closed. And so you're starting to kind of build this bridge of being able to go back and forth, but for it to be safe. And you've got anchors for ways to get out of it if it becomes overwhelming. And then you can build from there.
Yeah.
So I think this trauma,
Yeah, I mean,
go ahead, sorry.
no, I was just gonna say, I mean, I love how you're breaking this down because it shows that there's even more nuance than just these 4 or 5 states, right? There's also different ways to approach each of those meditation styles. You can do internal mindfulness, you can do external mindfulness, you can do eyes closed focus, you can do eyes open focus. And so this is where meditation becomes so not a one size fits all, but you can really get down into the nitty gritty details of what's going to be best for this person at their situation and this time in their life. And we often will start people with more external mindfulness or like grounding, like paying, feeling their body against a surface, like a floor or a chair or a bed, or kind of being aware of sensory cues in their environment for exactly the reason you're talking about is sometimes that's the best place to bring yourself into your body, but in a way that maybe feels a little safer, a little less charged.
Yeah, brilliant. And I appreciate that so much that's the way you guys approach your work because, and I think people are getting better, and by people I mean meditation teachers,
Yeah.
but at being more trauma aware, trauma informed in their practices. But certainly, 10, 20 years ago, that was not the case. It was very much kind of like, here's the system.
Yeah.
Everybody needs to do the same thing.
Yeah.
And, I feel like we're moving more and more to more of this individualized approach and
Yeah.
understanding that there's a lot of ways to help people work with these practices that they can do.
Yeah.
And actually, that's one of the things that's encouraging for me is that I've yet to see somebody that couldn't find a way to engage in these practices. If they
Right.
kind of hang in there a little bit, sometimes there's some trial and error and you have to
Yeah.
figure some things out. But I've yet to see somebody that this kind of approach doesn't work for.
Yeah.
And so to me, that's really encouraging because, you know, when I used to do more kind of workshops, I would often ask people at the very beginning, maybe there's 30 or 40 people in the room, and I'd say, okay, if you're a meditator, raise your hand.
Mhm.
And, if there's 40 people in the room, maybe 4 people would raise their hand.
Mhm.
Now, this is a workshop on meditation, right? Like you might expect there to be a higher number, but so 10% raise their hand. And then if I say, how many people have ever meditated? Like everybody in the room, raises
Right.
their hand. And so
Yeah.
it's like, okay,
Yeah.
so to me, it's like obvious that we all understand that meditation is good for us and that it's beneficial, but most of us don't stick with it.
Yeah.
And so it's like, well, how do we bridge that, right? How do we help people to be able to stick with it so they really get the benefit? It's like going to the gym. If you go to the gym, once every 2 weeks,
Right.
eh,
Yeah. Well, and that's another great metaphor I'll use with people. You may use something like this too, is sometimes people will come to me frustrated, like I'm trying to do the meditations and like I suck at it, like it's going so badly. And I'll ask them how long they've been trying, and usually it's like, well, a week or maybe 2 weeks. And I say, if you had never been to the gym before, would you be expecting to deadlift 300 pounds 2 weeks in? Of course, they're like, well, no. It's like, yeah, you'd be like doing little 50-pound deadlifts or something like that, probably, right? And it's the same thing. Like maybe you get like these little tiny glimpses of what you're trying to do, but most of the time it's not going to feel that successful. And that's normal. That's not a failure. That's normal.
for sure. And even, people who've been meditating, and I'm sure you can relate to this, people who've been meditating a long time, there's certain days where you sit down to meditate and it's like, oh my God,
Yeah,
like,
not
okay,
happening. Yeah.
like what is going on? Like my
Yeah.
brain is just all over the place. And that's normal too, right? It's just like, it's just part of the game, which is, I really like that we call it a practice,
Yes.
because it's like, well, there's no point at which you're going to kind of get to the end and be like, I did it. I have succeeded. It's
Yeah.
like, no, it's just an ongoing, continuous work,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah. Yeah, and another point you've kind of alluded to that I want to dig into a little is maybe the idea that on paper, theoretically, the most beneficial meditation style for a specific goal or outcome isn't the best one to start with. Mike often brings up this example that, if you look at it theoretically, the, resolution for depression is really a compassion meditation, like an open heart meditation. But you're never going to be successful coming to someone in active depression and say, "Here, open your heart, like do this gratitude meditation." And you'll be like, "Are you kidding me?" And so that's another beautiful way that we can titrate things up. I also find that my clients who really dedicate themselves to their meditation practice and are able to get to that really compassion, open-hearted state, I tend to see those people make the most progress in their physical healing and recovery. But again, we can't necessarily jump straight to that when you're in severe pain or you've got these complex chronic illnesses or autoimmune disease. Like, you're not going to start meditating and be like, "Oh, I feel so like grateful and compassionate that I'm in this terrible physical state." Like, that's just not fair to ask anyone to do. And yet, when people are able to get there, suddenly their healing seems to progress so much faster just on a physical level. I'm wondering, and I'm kind of putting you on the spot here. I didn't ask this before, but have you seen any research about those kinds of open-hearted or compassionate states correlated with physical healing or anything like that? I'm very curious about it.
Yeah, I'm not specifically aware of that, specific question.
Hmm.
Most of the research that looks at physical healing and physical health tends to focus more on like the quiet mind
Oh, interesting.
type
Okay.
approaches. So, transcendental meditation, there's a
Hmm.
lot of data with that, which
Yeah,
fits into the quiet mind category.
right.
And, my guess is that the reason that that shows up is so significant is, because you're really getting into this deep state of relaxation. We talk a lot about that you can't relax your mind if your body's not relaxed.
Hmm.
So, so to get into a true quiet mind state, your mind and your body are very relaxed, which of course is super rejuvenating
Hmm.
and healing. And
Yeah.
so my guess is that's why that gets so much attention. But what you're
Hmm.
saying makes a lot of sense to me. And
Okay.
I wouldn't be surprised if there's research out there to support that.
Sure.
I'm just not aware of it.
Yeah.
But you bring up another really important point, which is that, even if that's the kind of the desired outcome is to get to this open heart kind of place,
Yeah.
that may be a fairly long process.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that I really like about the way you guys work and the way we kind of talk about things with neuromeditation is those baby steps,
Hmm.
right? Like, so moving from a focused meditation to open heart, well, how do you do that? Right? Because and so it's like, well, what are the baby steps? So, maybe the first step would be once you're pretty good at the eyes open focus, okay, then you do eyes closed focus. Okay, great. Now, once you can do that, now what if your point of focus is your heart center, right? So you're just breathing in and out of your heart center.
Hmm.
I'm not mentioning any emotions at all. I'm not
Right.
talking about compassion, but just by paying attention to your heart, it starts to open on its own in this kind of natural way, right? So
Wow.
you can start to so you can start to build off of what you already have and start adding in little components that add up to eventually you get to the open heart space. So it's almost blending, right? It's kind of like blending from one style into another. So they don't have to be discrete, the way we talk about them.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. That's so cool. Great. So, I guess maybe we can get now into some of your more recent research. And I think this is actually really relevant for a lot of the people watching this channel. And I mentioned this to you a little bit when we were in person together recently, that a lot of the people that we work with seem to be highly sensitive in every every sense of the word, right? That they are sensitive to toxins, they're sensitive to viruses, they're sensitive to stress, and they're sensitive to other people's emotions, other people's energy, and often sensitive to even spiritual experiences. They may be more able to access what might be called a more, mystical state or even maybe more of a, some might call it intuitive or psychic state, even. Like they just kind of know what is happening with other people. They can really feel into what other people are feeling, this kind of stuff. And so I think a lot of the people watching will be very interested in some of the work you've been doing. Do you want to share a little about that?
Yeah, you may have to give me a little bit more direction too, because
Okay.
it sounds like you've got something in particular you're wanting me to bring up, and so I want to make sure I get that without getting off
Not
track somewhere.
necessarily. We can kind of riff off it. I just think that a lot of people maybe have been told that um, well, a couple things. One is, oh, you're just overly sensitive, that maybe those qualities are actually like a detriment or a defect somehow, right? And I think some of your work may be showing that this might not be like a natural brain variation that some people just have, so maybe we can start there.
Yeah, yeah. So, it's an interesting thing because there are a certain segment of the population that are highly sensitive. And of course, there's more attention being drawn to that as well, like with the highly sensitive person
Hmm.
kinds of thing, right? Can't call it a diagnosis, but
Yeah.
whatever, right? It's a good descriptor for a lot of people. And yeah, it seems like it's kind of a normal variation. But you're right. We tend to, as a culture, we have this idea that everybody should behave the same way, right? Like it's like, hey, everybody needs to fit into this little box here,
Yeah.
and that's normal. And more and more, I really don't like those ideas because there's a lot of variations. Like humans, we're very diverse in a lot of ways, not just skin color and body size, but things like this. And so there's a couple of things that are interesting. One is how much can we learn to just sort of work with the way our system is,
Hmm.
right? And sort of accept some of that and learn to
Yeah.
work with it rather than trying to fight it. Now, on the other hand, there are some people where it's kind of like this is too much, right?
Sure.
Like how can I tamp this down a little
Yeah.
bit? And there's ways to do that potentially too, right? Because we're talking about parts of the brain
Hmm.
and they're different functions. And so of course there's going to be parts of the brain that are involved in things like sensory processing.
Hmm.
And so, if those parts of the brain are hypersensitive, hyper aware, hyper engaged, can we get them to quiet down a little bit? And does that kind of like help dampen a little bit of that sensitivity? So, there are approaches to do that. And actually, maybe that goes into this next little piece that I was thinking about. Because, one way to dampen that, of course, is going to be things like quiet mind, right? Because you're kind of reducing the amount of activity that's happening in the brain in specific regions. But one of the patterns that I've seen recently in a few people, it's like they shut everything down. It's like
Mm.
everything just drops out. And it's a very interesting state that seems to be connected with more like a non-dual state of consciousness. And
Can you
so,
say more about what you mean by that? No, non-dual state of consciousness?
yeah. So, it would be a state where there's really not a separation between you and the
Okay,
universe,
I see.
right?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
And so some people get there, through psychedelic experiences or things like
Sure.
that, right? Like people will do a heroic dose of mushrooms or something, and they have this experience of unity. You hear
Right.
people say that, it's like I was one with everything, kind of
Yeah.
a thing. So that'd be non-dual, right? There's no differentiation.
Yeah.
You are, I am, that kind of idea.
Right.
And so it's interesting because it seems like there are ways that we can see that in the brain
Mm.
of when people are kind of getting into that place
Yeah.
where your ego is no longer running the show. And so of course you can do a big experience like psychedelics or something else that can kind of knock you there. But it also seems like maybe an important skill to develop through meditation or through some other things. And again, it
Yeah.
kind of makes sense, right? If you can kind of separate from your identity,
Mhm.
even for a moment, often what that does is it creates some insights, some awarenesses, even some shifts in your neurological functioning.
Hmm.
So, I'm not saying that's the answer for some of these things. I'm just saying that there, I think, are ways to engage and work with some of that sensitivity that, can give you some insight, can help you start to figure out how to work with it, and maybe even, kind of dampen it a little bit if that's what you desire.
So I just want to clarify, are you saying that people who seem to be able to really shut all the areas of their brain down and experience is what's causing this experience of unity or oneness? Um, is that what you're saying is correlated?
That people who are highly sensitive, that they are more able to do that. Was
Well,
that the
you
question?
mentioned some people are just kind of shutting down, like there's just not much brain wave activity happening in their brain at all.
Right.
Is that correlated with this kind of non-dual state you're talking about? Is that what you're saying?
Shutting the
Okay.
brain down is
Yeah.
correlated with this non-dual state.
Okay. And so is that a kind of a remedy for like the highly sensitive person that you're talking about, or is that the state that maybe is sometimes overwhelming them? What are you seeing there?
I mean, my theory is that
Yeah.
that would be a way to kind of help manage that, right?
Okay.
Um, of kind of getting a little bit of a break, right?
Yeah.
From because I mean, I'm lucky that I'm not one of those highly sensitive people, but I can only imagine that it would feel like a bombardment,
It's like
right?
people are focused on like, oh, there's this thing over here, there's that thing over there, there's this thing here, there's this thing here. And if you're able to almost zoom out and experience the universe in this more like wholeness kind of way, then every little stimuli becomes less intense.
Yeah, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and so kind of being able to, step out of your little human
Yeah.
experience for a moment,
Yep. Yeah.
so that it's not overwhelming in the same way, right? That it's
Right.
like, because I mean, if we think about it, well, it's overwhelming because you are a human and you've got this human brain that's trying to process this information,
Trying to interpret it all. Yeah.
right? But if you're able
Yeah.
to step out of that for a minute, well, it's a non-issue,
Yeah.
right? And so even if that may not be a permanent solution, so to speak,
Sure.
but
You can't do
but
that all day.
no, you
Yeah.
can't do that all day,
Yeah.
unless you like live in a cave,
Right.
somewhere, and, but it can be a significant break, and
Yeah.
sometimes those breaks are enough, right, to
And
help
I
us kind
wonder
of.
if that's, sorry, I was just going to add, I wonder if that's why some people end up finding so much refuge in prayer or spiritual practice, because I think some of those practices do stimulate a similar experience of that, like oneness with something greater than yourself, whether it's the universe or God or however you're framing it. Do you see a parallel there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes a lot of sense. And again, I don't know if it's necessarily the highly sensitive aspect, but
Yeah.
whatever it might be, right? I mean, just being a human is overwhelming.
Yeah.
I mean, the first rule of Buddhism, right, is that life involves suffering.
Yeah.
It's like, well, they got that right.
Yeah.
It's like if you're a human, if you're going to be here on this planet and in this body, you're going to suffer.
Yeah.
And so it's like, being able to, and of course, the answer to suffering is to learn how to relate to it differently. And part
Yeah.
of relating to it differently is this idea of separation.
Yeah.
Can you realize that it's like, oh, wait a minute, maybe I'm not who I think I am. Maybe I'm
Mm,
bigger than what I think I am.
right.
Maybe I'm more spacious. Maybe I don't have to hold on to these thoughts and feelings and perceptions the way that I've been doing, right?
Yeah.
And so if we can change that, then all of a sudden a lot of that suffering goes away. It's I mean, it's straight out of Buddhism, right? But I think they got some things right.
Yeah. Yeah. Very cool. Was there another point you were going to make about that, or we
No,
wrapped?
no, and I don't know if I actually answered your question or I took it sideways there. So
No, I think that's helpful. I mean, I kind of want to just non-pathologize people's high sensitivity. I mean, yes, I think that there are absolutely ways that we can train the brain to um, like tone these characteristics, so that maybe they don't cause quite as much suffering for people. Absolutely. But I do agree that humans are diverse, brains are diverse. We need a lot of different kinds of people to make a functioning society, and we need some people who are more sensitive. So it's more about learning to work with and then, train your brain appropriately when that makes sense.
Yeah, love it. I think I agree. I think that's a great way to think about it.
Yeah.
I and again, not to take it too sideways here, but recently I was working with these non-speaking autistic individuals
Yes.
who demonstrate just some remarkable telepathic abilities. And, people may hear that and be like, okay, come on, this. And it's like, we don't have time to get into it,
I
but
don't know. That podcast is blowing up. I think more people are open to this idea now than maybe were even a month ago. Yeah.
that's true.
Yeah.
And so the podcast, to plug the podcast, the
Yes.
telepathy tapes,
Yeah.
but yeah, it is blowing up. And, for me, one of the things from that experience, I got to work with three of those individuals.
Hmm.
And for me, one of the things that I really gained from that personally was shifting my perception of these non-speakers.
Mm,
I wasn't even aware of it at the moment, but I had sort of a pathological view,
right.
because of their behaviors, right? They have these unusual, atypical behaviors, rocking, yelling things, hitting themselves, things that when you see the behavior, it's kind of like, oh, you presume that they're not competent.
Yeah.
And when you really start to when they start to be able to communicate and you find out, oh my God, like not only are they competent, they're genius.
Right.
And it's like, okay. So for me, it didn't just change my perception of non-speakers, but it made me like rethink the way I judge everybody,
Mm,
right? Is because it's like, wow, probably everybody is much more competent and much more genius than I'm aware of. Like
yeah.
you only see what you see, right? And and so again, I'm bringing this up sort of in the context of the highly sensitive folks, right? That it's
Yeah.
like it may look like a certain thing on the outside, but what is the genius inside? What does that allow? What does that create? What opportunities, what abilities does that facilitate that
Mhm.
people who aren't as sensitive will never experience, right? And yeah, it may make it difficult to operate in this world, but there's also some gifts in there. I'm willing to bet. If you know if you know where to find them.
Oh my gosh, so beautiful. Yeah, how much, well, it's humbling. It's beautiful and it's humbling because as to your point, how much genius and gift and skill is hiding under the surface in just the people walking by us every day who have never had the opportunity or attention to maybe recognize or develop those gifts. So, yeah, I think that might make everyone shift the way they just engage in the world by hearing that. Beautiful.
Well, I mean, I don't know, but I mean, it's changed my perspective for sure. And so, I think, and again, I think it does apply to some of the highly sensitive folks, right? That I would not be shocked in the least bit if some of them were very intuitive. In fact, I know they are,
Yeah.
and have some abilities in terms of understanding, empathy,
Yeah.
attunement that other folks would never understand. And that can be a gift. I mean, gift and a curse, right? They go together sometimes.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and so many people that I work with have just been told, by doctors, perfectly well-meaning, of course, but who have been trained in this very Western medical perspective, that like their bodies are defective, they're broken, if they're believed at all, right? Some of people, unfortunately, are just, told they couldn't be experiencing what they're experiencing. But even if they're believed that, oh, yes, you have this, genetic defect, or you have this incurable condition or this or that, when we flip it on its head, like that might actually be some of those symptoms might just be a side effect of having these highly sensitive gifts. And how does it change your perception of yourself to look at it that way?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I love it.
Great. Well, I feel like that's a really beautiful note to end on. So I think we can kind of wrap it up. But yeah, I guess
Okay.
are there any last things that you feel like you want to share? Maybe anything that you feel like people really misunderstand about meditation that you want to clear up, or just any kind of final thought?
I mean, I feel like we covered a lot of really solid territory. I think the only thing that I would just add is that we didn't really get into this well, I don't think at all really, but there are also tools out there to help people figure out how to get into some of these states of consciousness. And I know you guys are going to start working with this as well, but including like we talked about at the beginning, neurofeedback
Yes.
combined with meditation. And
Hmm.
even though at the beginning I was kind of, I kind of wrote it off, right? And that was because it was all alpha and it didn't really work.
Right.
But now what we've been able to do is develop these protocols that are much more specific
Yeah.
to what region of the brain, what brain waves are happening with different meditations. And so it's like the perfect training wheels to get feedback, get live feedback, real time, on what your brain is doing when you're meditating. So it can let you know, like, yeah, you're in the zone. Nope, you missed it. Can you find that space?
Mhm.
And so getting that immediate feedback is so helpful for so many people. And so partly I just wanted to bring that up because we didn't really get a chance to talk about it very much.
Mhm.
I'm excited that you guys are going to start offering that in the near future.
We are,
As
yeah.
something,
So this
yeah,
will be another exclusive, you heard it here first moment that Soothe Wellness and Whole Body Healing will be offering some neurofeedback come probably April, something around there. So stay tuned for that. So exciting. Yeah. I agree. For some people who it's just like they just can't quite wrap their head around how to even start getting into some of these states, it can be such a great tool.
for sure.
Great. So neuromeditationinstitute.com. Do you have anything else you want to plug?
No, I mean, yeah, if people are interested in learning more, yeah, they can go to the website. There's lots of resources on there. Uh, a lot of free stuff. We have a YouTube channel with a lot of videos on there. And of course, we have classes and workshops and things like that if people really want to take a deeper dive. But yeah, I'd say just go to the website if you want to learn more.
Awesome. Okay, well, thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me.
Great.